Howdy, everyone. Our preacher today, Vance Halfaker, is a third-year seminarian and a member of the Episcopal Church. He began his academic career as a student of English literature, but these days he spends most of his time studying Hebrew and Greek. He has preached and taught adult Christian education classes in the Baptist and Disciples congregations. And as a preacher, Vance strives to bring the findings of critical and post-critical studies into dialogue with the church's mission and confession, exploring the implications of a robustly Nicene faith for 21st century questions around racial and social justice. So without further ado, here's a word from Vance Halfaker, MDiv student and our Walker preaching scholar.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Almost 3 years ago, I sat down to write my seminary application essays. One of these essays had a prompt asking me to identify one significant or haunting question I brought with me to the world of formal theological education. And the question I submitted was this: what does the church contribute as the church to the struggle for justice and the common good? Lingering behind that question was probably another question. Why did I have this compulsion to give years of my life to a theological seminary of all things, when I could seek out a career in law or medicine or education or social work or any number of other professions that were doing more obvious and more quantifiable good? I know that for many seminarians, the outbreak of COVID-19 has added to these insecurities. In this time of pandemic, what do the church's ministers have to say to people other than wear masks, social distance, trust the science, practice self-care? Granted, we can and must say all that, just as we can and must partner with people of all faiths and no faith in working for a better world through law, medicine, any number of God-given vocations for the world's well-being. We can and must do all this, but if we stop there, if we do only all these good and necessary things, we still haven't answered that question from my admissions essay. What does the church contribute as the church? We still haven't acted out of a unique calling and vocation placed upon us to proclaim the glory of the God who has swallowed up death. Our passage from the Hebrew Scriptures this morning begins with a declaration of praise. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name. The praise here given to God is elicited by God's acts, and specifically God's acts in making the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. In other words, acts of judgment. At Brite Divinity School, we like to talk about justice, but we don't always like to talk about judgment. I have come to believe this is a mistake. In the conceptual world of the Hebrew Scriptures, these two ideas, justice and judgment, are inseparable. We have a God who judges, and this is something we should embrace. Because the opposite of judgment is not tolerance or inclusivity. The opposite of judgment is impunity. In 2020, we don't have to look long and hard for examples of impunity. Public officials in the highest offices of the land commit acts of fraud, deceit, and rank abuse of public trust and face no consequences because others have placed party and in-group loyalty above the truth. Impunity. Officers of the law appointed to protect and serve instead shoot and kill unarmed citizens with no provocation, and never face charges, much less sentences. Impunity. This is the very thing we cry out against when we take up the refrain, no justice, no peace. I know folks at a disciple seminary are not big on creeds, but stay with me on this one. Those of us who belong to churches that recite the Nicene Creed week to week confess not simply that Christ will return, but that he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. This is good news. This is the metaphysical heft behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous statement that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That Christ will judge the living and the dead is good news, but also sobering news for all of us caught up in complex systems of oppression that were in place long before we were born, who hurt our neighbors without even knowing how or why. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. The knowledge that God is setting and will set the world right does not excuse us from the responsibility to do what we can, but it does free us from the kind of anxious perfectionism that would keep us from doing anything for fear of doing something wrong. It reminds us that things are not up to us alone. I've been at Brite for a while now, and I know a lot of you pretty well. I know some of you expect a sermon from me to be more engaged with biblical scholarship, which is, after all, my thing. I don't want to disappoint you entirely. The section of 1st Isaiah from which this passage is taken consists of chapters 24 through 27, and historical critical scholars aren't entirely sure what to do with it. In fact, the first commentary I consulted when preparing this sermon calls this one of the most difficult sections to interpret in the whole book of Isaiah. Scholars place it anywhere from the 6th to the 2nd century BCE. Generally, scholars who prefer a later date do so because they see in these passages apocalyptic images and motifs associated with the Second Temple period and the latest books of the Hebrew Bible. Following the recent studies of Christopher Hayes, I take a different view. I think that this text comes from the 620s or 610s BCE in the context of King Josiah's campaigns against the Assyrians. From a strictly historical perspective, this passage is in part ancient war propaganda, not exactly the literary genre of choice at a place like Brite. But historical context does shed some light on the troubling language used in this passage about the people the NRSV text calls aliens. These references to the palace of aliens and the noise of aliens are not so much xenophobic bluster. They describe the kingdom of Judah's much stronger imperial neighbors, the Assyrians, who have already overthrown and subjugated the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians, bent on seizing valuable land and resources to fuel their war against some of Judah's other powerful neighbors, the Babylonians. Judah, then, is celebrating a brief respite in its long uphill struggle against powerful and ambitious imperial neighbors, an effort that will rapidly unravel in the next generation when Josiah's sons face the new world power, Babylon. This context of struggle and relative weakness shows up just how audacious some of the claims of this passage really are. This kingdom, Judah, is, in the ordinary geopolitical calculus of the time, pretty insignificant. Yet here it is, claiming that this nation, because of this nation's God, is dead center of the unfolding of world history. On this mountain, our writer says, not just any mountain, but Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where the temple of the God of Jacob, the Holy One of Israel, stands. The Lord of hosts will make for all peoples. The God who is chosen to be known as the Holy One of Israel is the God of all peoples and invites all peoples to God's victory feast. A feast of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. A feast, in other words, where only the best fare is served to everyone. And in this prophetic vision, all the peoples come to this feast joyfully with eager expectation. And why? Because they see that the Holy One of Israel has stilled the song of the ruthless, has been a refuge to the poor and a refuge to the needy in their distress, a shelter from the rainstorm and a shade from the heat. And the text goes further. On this day of God's great victory feast, God will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all the nations. The shroud and the sheet here are either mourning garments or burial cloths. And God will swallow up death forever, will swallow up death forever. This beautiful poetic image takes on even richer meaning if you know a little ancient Near Eastern mythology. In Canaanite myth, death is personified by the god Mot, who swallows up the fertility god Baal-Hadad. Baal's reemergence from the belly of Mot is tied to the agricultural cycle, new life springing out of the dead earth. But the biblical tradents adapt and subvert this myth. The tables are turned, and the God of Israel swallows up death, and this is the key word, forever. The cycle is over. The devourer is devoured. This God has triumphed over death decisively, irreversibly, forever. Like I said, in its original context, this was probably war propaganda. But like all good poetry, it manages to find a life beyond its context, to shed light on all kinds of new contexts. Moreover, for Christian ministers, which many of us gathered on Zoom today are, this is Holy Scripture, inspired by God, useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. This text is among those that fired the imagination of the earliest generation of Christian leaders. It finds echoes in the book of Revelation's vision of the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven, a world without hunger, thirst, violence, or oppression, a world where the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's people, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the former things have passed away. Our passage from Isaiah fueled the apocalyptic imagination of the Apostle Paul, who quotes it directly alongside the words of another Hebrew prophet in his famous words on the resurrection of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Perhaps from a Christian perspective, it is Paul who best grasps the decisiveness, the finality of God's victory over death when he says, "We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him." At this moment in the life of our nation, we cannot avoid a long and sober look at the power of death. The death of over 220,000 people of COVID-19 in this country alone. The death of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jonathan Price, and far too many other unarmed Black Americans at the hands of officers of the law. The living death faced every day by victims of mass incarceration and the children kept in cages at our border. We must not mince words. We must not minimize, deny, or seek to numb ourselves with sentimentality or easy assurances that everything will be okay. We are facing down death, and we need the God who has conquered death. As Christians, we can take this all a step further yet. As Christians, we can say that the God who swallowed up death did so precisely in being swallowed up by death. As our Eastern Orthodox siblings sing in Eastertide, Christ is risen from the dead. trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. The one who has triumphed knows in his own body the very worst human beings can do to one another. If that's not embodying justice, I don't know what is. The one who conquered death, who will come again to be our judge, is the same one who walked with us in the valley of the shadow of death, who in today's terms stood in absolute solidarity with the essential worker risking her health for a subsistence wage, with the queer young person rejected by their family, with the black man choked in the street for no reason other than the color of his skin. Christ has stepped fully into the reality of the sick, the suffering, the victims of injustice, and Christ has triumphed. As a much better preacher put it so many centuries ago, he has destroyed death by enduring it. He destroyed hell when he descended into it. He put into an uproar, even as it tasted of his flesh. Hell took a body and discovered God. It took earth and encountered heaven. It took what it saw and was overcome by what it did not see. I do not know what is coming for this nation in the weeks ahead. I am as anxious as anyone here this morning, and I can offer no cheap guarantee that things will not get worse before they get better. But one thing I do know, that this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Amen.